with the jungle leaning in on it. It is a strange place, but it's not nearly as bizarre as the garden that was made here by someone who is no more a local than I am. I'm about to go into a garden which I think could only have been made here in the jungle in Mexico, given the timing and the circumstances of its creation. However, its creator was a very English eccentric. This garden is some 50 acres of tamed jungle and contains over 200 whimsical and weird concrete structures, and all are the creation of Edward James. Edward James first came to Mexico in 1947, and he chose to settle in this spot because he came with a friend and walked up this ravine, and they found these natural pools. The friend stripped off, had a swim, and then lay on the rocks sunbathing. And as he did so, apparently a cloud of blue butterflies descended on the body and just smothered him with these blue butterflies. And Edward James thought this was such a fantastically surreal image that he saw this as a sign that this was where he had to make his surreal garden. Edward James was born into great wealth. His family owned the huge West Dean estate in Sussex. However, James made his name and another fortune in the 1920s and 30s when he began collecting surrealist art. The initial plans for Las Posas seem to have been relatively modest, at least in the terms of an eccentric multimillionaire. More like a private zoo than a jungle fantasy, and he did ship a menagerie of caged animals to Xilitla. But by 1960, James began to talk about creating his extraordinary dreamlike constructions. He said he decided to build them simply because he liked to see something nice. And casually at first, and later obsessively, his subconscious began to take literal concrete form in the middle of the jungle. See, look at that. It's extraordinary. It doesn't rationalize, but is it beautiful? And does it need to be beautiful? I don't know. This place just plunges you under the water of irrationality and the subconscious and says, swim. Haven't a clue I'm going. I'm completely, totally lost. You can see pieces of James's cultural history almost glued to the surface of this, the fleur-de-lis in the middle of the Mexican jungle. And of course, if this was in Europe, the health and safety police would have closed it down. Unsafe, and what they'd really be saying is not just unsafe for your body, but unsafe for your mind. You shouldn't be having these thoughts. But James could do what he liked in Xilitla. Mexico wasn't judgmental about personal behavior in the way that Europe and America were. It was also without building regulation of any kind, and there was a local and very cheap labour force only too glad of the work. I'm bedeviled and struggling with this idea of beauty as a pure thing. And this place, which is chaos, in a sense. Ugly things next to beautiful things. I mean, look at that. Look at that thing. For me, it's not doing anything other than being kitsch and naff, and it's absolutely no better or worse than a garden gnome. Now this, I think, is fantastic, is where you have plant-like forms encrusted with moss and lichen and ferns, with trees of vaguely similar form growing up around them. You don't quite know which is which. So cheek by jowl with the most wonderful, exotic, beautiful, fabulous stuff is a bit of complete kitsch. And it's upsetting me. I don't know what to think. I mean, there is a fact. I could just be a boring old fart who likes the vaguely familiar and finds aspects of this sort of surrealistic way of doing things in a garden as too unsettling. It rattles my cage a bit too much. The weather changes from hot and steamy to rainy and surprisingly cool. To find out more about James, I'm meeting the current owner, James's godson, Plutarco Gastelum. Plutarco's father was in charge of the day-to-day building work in the garden, and James would often stay with the family on his visits to Mexico. So Plutarco knew James since he was a small child. You grew up here, didn't you?
Yes.
What was it like being a child in this garden?
It was magical. It was magical because it was like a different country. I mean, now it's different. It's fantastic, but kind of ghostly or melancholic. But at that time, it was very vivid because we had more than 100 workers. They were all my friends. And Edward James used to have a lot of animals too. At that point, the place looked like a private zoo or something like that, so it was an incredible place for a child.
What was he like as a man? Describe to me your memories of him.
Yeah, that's something because I have a different perception I could see because for my sisters and I, he was our private Santa. But I could see with my parents it was more difficult, especially my father, because my father was in charge of all the mundane matters about building a place like this, no? Pay the bills, keep the records. And I could see that he was difficult because he didn't have schedules, not even to eat or to sleep. He didn't realize very well about the mundane world. No? So my father complained a lot about that, but at the same time, he was laughing all the time about the adventures of Edward James here in Mexico.
Las Posas is unedited, unfettered, unbalanced, and completely unworldly, and its future is uncertain. Plutarco told me he employs 50 people whose sole job is to cut back the jungle. Perhaps James could afford his follies to be so extreme because he knew the jungle would one day consume them, just as it has consumed the lost Aztec cities.
We use words cheaply when we're describing gardens, and I know I'm as guilty as anybody, but this, more than any other garden in the world, can truly be described as fantastic. It is like no other. And yet, again and again, as I walk around it, I'm reminded of an 18th century milord, touring Europe, buying extraordinary things, and using them to create a series of follies in a landscape park with ruined chapels and temples and rerouted rivers and villages swept away so a ha-ha can be built. And that the result is this extraordinary creation in the middle of the Mexican jungle just makes it even more extraordinary and unlike anything else.
What I have seen in Mexico has been inspiring and fascinating, from the ancient history of the floating gardens to Barragan's great volumes of colour and light, and the cool, clean lines of the cactus garden, built upon its sense of local identity. And now I'm moving on to a very different world, albeit geographically close to Mexico, where the gardens are a product of political necessity and social will. My journey takes me to the largest island in the Caribbean. Cuba lies just 140 miles to the east of Mexico.